Okay, so we'll get through. I promise we'll get through it. So I just want to quickly go over the object lessons that we talked about last week. Jeremiah 18, obviously the potter and the clay, where Yahweh is telling Israel that they are destined for destruction. And that phrase that he uses there is because Yahweh is trying to get them to see through the object lesson of Jeremiah that just because you're making choices and this is your destiny doesn't mean you can't change. And so what he's trying to do is get Israel to change, come back into relationship with him. And then Isaiah chapter 8, where Judah, the nation of Judah, is considering being in alignment with the king of Assyria due to the rumors of war from Israel and Syria. And they're choosing to be in relationship with the king of Assyria instead of being in relationship with Yahweh. And what Isaiah talks about is Yahweh is your place of safety. And if you don't choose Yahweh as your place of safety, this will become a stumbling block for you. And it will cause you to be in a wrong relationship and cause you to fail. And then you get into Hosea, and Hosea is, again, Yahweh's object lesson of Israel and Judah are chasing after Canaanite gods. And they are in relationship with Yahweh, and then they chase after Canaanite gods, and then they come back, and then they go, and then they come back. And he uses this relationship of Hosea and Gomer to show that he wants to be in relationship with them, but they are choosing to be in a situation where he doesn't show them compassion, they aren't his people, and they are calling other gods their gods. And so we did all that backstory because when you get into Romans 9, Paul reconstructs those specific prophecies to then change some things in the Israelites' view. And so the first part of Romans 1 through 3, 1 through 4, talk about Israel deciding, okay, those particular Christians are accepting Jesus as the Messiah, as the Anointed One, and they are tolerating the Gentiles accepting Jesus as the Anointed One, but they need to fall in line and do what the law says. And so the first part of Romans really is Paul distinguishing for them. It doesn't matter if you follow the law. That's not what saves you. What saves you is trusting in Jesus and the overall plan. And then we get into Romans chapter 8 where Paul explains and teaches about the Holy Spirit. And then you get in Romans chapter 9. And so you got to get all that backstory to get Romans chapter 9. And in my opinion, Romans chapter 9, Paul asks some questions in Romans 9 that pertain to us today as we engage the nations around us. And I'll show you what those are. But if you're on social media at all, you begin to see what the people around us are asking. And Paul asks the exact same questions here. So Romans chapter 9, the people of Israel, chosen to be God's adopted children, he made covenants with them, and yet they are not saved. And so then he asks the question, does this mean that Yahweh failed to fulfill his promise to Israel? And so what he's telling Israel is that, yeah, you were the chosen people. Yahweh adopted you, chose you to be the image bearer to be the reflection of Yahweh to the other nations. That was your role. But you're not saved. And so, does that mean that Yahweh failed because Israel isn't saved? That's the question. And then he goes on to answer, no, not all of you who are born into the nation of Israel are truly members of Israel, because being a physical descendant of Abraham does not mean you're necessarily a child of God. And so what Paul is doing here is he's building this distinction of just because you're an ethnic Israelite doesn't mean you're a spiritual Israelite. It doesn't mean that you're saved just because of your nationality or because of where you are. It doesn't mean that you're saved. And so then he goes on to explain really the thing that we talked about in Malachi. Malachi does the same thing. That Jacob was loved and Esau was hated, or Esau was rejected. And he's not talking about Jacob the person and Esau the person. He's talking about Jacob the nation, the Israelite nation, and Esau, which would be the Gentiles, being rejected. And so he's making that distinction because that is what God chooses. Because he's leading up to an answer to that question. So then he says, Yahweh chose Sarah over Abram's other wives, and with Rebekah he chose Jacob over Esau. So that means God is not just and God is not fair because he chose one over the other. And this is the question that we hear in the world around us if we're listening. That God's not fair. This isn't fair. This is God's fault. He's not fair. And so I don't want to be in a relationship with somebody who's not just and not fair. And so Paul puts that question out there because you have this Israelite choice of what Yahweh is doing, that means it's not fair. And so then he goes on to answer that question. No, God is just. And let me prove to you God is just. Because your thought process of justice and fairness isn't Yahweh's. It's not the same. And so then he goes on to say, this is what Moses said. I will have mercy on those who I have mercy, and I will have compassion on those I have compassion. And so Paul's quoting Exodus 33:19, and it's actually part B of 33:19. And what part A says is a little bit different, because what 33:19 actually says is, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will show you the character of Yahweh before you. I have mercy on those who I have mercy, and I have compassion on those who I have compassion. So in this question of is God fair, Paul responds with this quote. And this quote comes from Moses goes up onto the mountain, gets the 10 commandments, and as he's coming down, Yahweh says, you need to get back down there because they are not doing what you left them to do. And as he comes back in, he hears this singing, he sees the golden calf, and while he's been on the mountain with Yahweh, the Israelites are now chasing after Baal. And Moses comes in and says, I don't believe this. I've been gone and you are already rejecting Yahweh. To which Yahweh says, you're right. I'm going to give them the promised land, but I'm not going. And then Moses says, well, wait a minute. If you're not going, I'm not going. I want to be in a relationship with you. To which Yahweh says, okay, this is going to be a rough road, but I'm going to go. And then Moses responds to Yahweh and says, okay, I'm going to need you to give me a little bit of proof on that. I'm going to need you to show me that you're really going to go with me? And then Yahweh responds, okay, here's what we'll do. I can't show you me because you can't handle it. But what I'll do is, here's a mountain. I'm going to put you in this cave, and I'm going to pass in front of it, and I'm going to allow my goodness, my nature. You're going to be able to see that, but you're not going to see me personally because you can't handle it. And I'm going to have mercy on those who I have mercy, and I'm going to have compassion on those who I have compassion. Because what he's saying there is, I should just end our relationship right here. But I'm not going to. I'm going to have mercy on them because you've asked me to. And so when there is this question of God's justice, well, what is just? Well, Yahweh should have destroyed them right there. And yet he chose not to destroy them. I had compassion on them. And then he goes on, Romans chapter 9, verse 17. God tells Pharaoh, I have appointed you for the very purpose of displaying my power in you and to spread fame throughout the earth. So you see, it doesn't depend on human desire or effort. God chooses to show mercy to some, and he chooses to harden the hearts of others as they refuse to listen. And so Paul goes back to this Moses and Pharaoh of, look, you have two settings here. Yahweh chooses to have compassion here, and then Moses, with Pharaoh, he chooses to allow Pharaoh to have his heart hardened, and Pharaoh continues to behave a certain way, and yet Yahweh looks at that and says, okay, I can use that. I can use that to show my power. So then Paul asks this question. Well, then you might say, why do we blame God for not responding? Haven't they simply done what God makes them do? So here's the way that question is posed today. I don't know that I can be in relationship with who you call God, because how is it fair that God sends people to hell for not believing in him? That's not fair. That's manipulation. And so Paul asks this question, okay, well, if Yahweh has mercy on some and some are hardened, then how does God say, well, how can you blame them? Because they're just reacting to the way God behaves. And so that's what Paul poses as the question. And here's his answer. No, don't say that. Who are you, a mere human being, to argue with God? Should the thing that was created say to the one who created it, why have you made me like this? When a potter makes jars out of clay, doesn't he have a right to use the same lump of clay to make one jar for decoration and another lump of clay into a trash can? Doesn't the potter have that right? And he's beginning to use this potter clay object lesson to then pull in what Jeremiah said. In the same way, even though God has the right to show his anger and his power, he's very patient with those on whom his anger falls, who are destined for destruction. And so when he uses that destined for destruction phrase, everybody that hears that is thinking automatically back to the Jeremiah passage, where Yahweh is telling them, look, you're choosing to be out of relationship with me, but I'm going to be patient with you, and I'm going to wait in hopes that you're going to change. And I just want to pause, because not long ago I heard somebody praying that for Jesus to hurry up and come back. I'm ready for Jesus to come back, which I have to confess, in there are times that when I get frustrated and tired, that was my prayer. Emmy calls me out on that and says, well, that's pretty selfish because you're wanting Jesus to come back before some people have accepted their relationship with Jesus. And when you read this passage and you get a fuller understanding of what Paul is saying we should not be praying for Jesus to come. We should be thanking them for being patient and waiting to come, so that those who are not in relationship with Jesus have time to get into relationship with Jesus. That's what Paul's talking about. He's like, the nations around us, they're destined for destruction. But we should be thankful that Yahweh is waiting. And he's waiting for them to come into relationship. The same way that he waited in Jeremiah. The same way that he's waiting here. He's waiting for them to come to the full knowledge of Jesus. Rather than, okay, we're going to go ahead and go, and we're going to destroy, and we're going to send people to hell. That's not what we should be wanting. And then so Paul goes on. He does this. Why is Yahweh waiting? Why is he being patient? He does this to make the riches of his glory shine even brighter on those whom he shows mercy, who were prepared in advance for glory. And we were among those who were selected, both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, so this riches of glory phrase, Paul uses this in nearly every letter that he writes. This riches of glory. He uses it in 1 Corinthians. He uses it in Ephesians, in Philippians, Colossians. And what he's showing there is this same thing, that we have a responsibility. We are to reflect the nature of Yahweh. And this shining riches of glory is showing that Yahweh has done something in this plan to bring us into relationship with him. And he's wanting us, and he's using the Jews and the Gentiles, he's wanting us to be part of that plan so that people can see the power of Yahweh. That's what he's showing. Okay, so then God also says in the prophecy of Hosea, those who were not my people, I will now call my people, and I will call her beloved those who were called not beloved before. And then at the place where they were told, you are not my people, there they will be called the children of the living God. Now, Paul rephrases what Yahweh told Hosea. Because what Yahweh is talking about is that the Israelites, when they come back into relationship, they will be my people and they will call me their God. What Paul does here is he changes that and brings in the Gentiles. That even though the Gentiles were not his people, now, because of the Christ event, Gentiles have access to being called children of the living God. And so, in our theme of Paul's misuse of the Old Testament, Paul's absolutely misusing what was Hosea said to now include what the Gentiles. And then he goes on. And concerning Israel, Isaiah the prophet called out, though the people of Israel are as numerous as the sand on the seashore, only a remnant will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth quickly and with finality. And Isaiah said the same thing in another place. If Yahweh's armies had not spared a few of our children, we would have been wiped out like Sodom and Gomorrah. And what he's doing is he's getting ready to tell them, hey, just because you're an Israelite doesn't mean you're saved. And if you don't choose to follow Yahweh through this Christ event, it's going to be a problem. What does all this mean? Even though the Gentiles were not trying to follow God's righteousness. They were made righteous with God, and it was by faith that this took place. But the people of Israel, who tried so hard to get right with God by keeping the law, they never succeeded. Why not? Because they were trying to get righteous. They were trying to be saved. They were trying to get in a right relationship with God by keeping what the law said instead of by trusting in Him. They have stumbled over the great rock in their path. And when he uses that phrase, all of them immediately think back to the Isaiah passage. God warned them of this in the scriptures when he said, I'm placing a stone in Jerusalem that makes people stumble, a rock that will make them fail, but anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Okay, so Paul shifts this whole thing right here, because in the Isaiah passage, Yahweh is the stumbling block. And the relationship with Yahweh and choosing not to be in relationship with Yahweh is what causes Israel to fall. Paul takes that and he changes it and says, no, Jesus is the stumbling block. And if you don't have faith in Jesus, then you will fail. And he just changes that just a little to then help the Israelites see when Yahweh was talking about him being the stumbling block, now he's talking about Jesus being the stumbling block. He's equating Jesus and Yahweh as the divine, okay? Which, for most Israelites, that was a problem because they have been looking for the Messiah. They've been looking for the anointed one, for the seed of God. They're looking for that. And Jesus comes in and says, I am the Messiah. And they say, well, no, that can't be, because the Messiah is supposed to set us free, and you're dead. And we are still in captivity of the Romans. And Paul is like, no, you're missing the point. It's not a physical freedom. It's a spiritual freedom. And so then, we're barely going to get through, but I promise we are. Romans chapter 10. Dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. I know what enthusiasm they have for God, but it's misdirected zeal. For they don't understand God's way of making people right with himself. Refusing to accept God's way, they cling to their own way of getting right with God by trying to keep what the law says, by what the Bible says. Now this is where I have failed in my young Christian walk. I thought by getting right with God, I can do that by following what the Bible says. And Paul is saying, listen, Romans, Israelites, you're missing it. You're paying so much attention to what the law says, you're missing the fact that by trusting in God is what saves you. Not by being circumcised, not by doing the right dietary restrictions. And so he's going back to that, making that point again. For Christ has already accomplished the purpose for which the law was given. As a result, all who believe in him are made right with God. Okay, so why is this important to us? Two things. Paul says that we, us today, participate in the rescue plan. And so the rescue plan is how Yahweh is calling the other nations into relationship with him. And so we have the opportunity to participate in that. And we participate in that the same way Israel was supposed to participate, by reflecting Yahweh to the nations. Because when the other nations see Yahweh and see the Christ event, then they are able to understand what the relationship means and how to get to that relationship. If we're not doing our part to reflect that, and I just have to get on to myself of, sometimes people look at the way my church life is, and my parents, we joke now because we taught ourselves, well, you have to go to church Sunday and Wednesday, and every time the doors are open, you have to be there, because that's the right thing to do. That's how you are in a right relationship with God. And we joke about that now because it's like, okay, well, that's really not what it was about, was it? But I miss that point. I miss that it's about being in trusting relationship and walking out my faith and realizing that Yahweh is at work around us, and I need to see what is going on and join in that, rather than doing it the way I've historically done it. And that's just me griping at myself. Because righteousness is based on trust in Yahweh's fulfillment. Okay, so where do we go from here? So Paul uses chapter 9 as this transition in his letter. And so from here he's going to point to, okay, so how do we walk out in this? How do we walk in this faithfulness to Yahweh? What does that look like? And whether we're in a Jew and Gentile church, or whether we're in the Church of Christ, or whether we're in America, in Collin County, what does that look like? And so in his letter, he transitions to that, and Jess is going to pull you in over the next 2 weeks and show you what that looks like, going from chapter 10, going through the rest of the Roman letter. Okay? So you got to come back, get those 2 lessons, and then we'll kick you off into Jude, and that'll be fun.
And all the weirdness it brings.
All the weirdness that brings. But, I was thinking about this. All of the New Testament writers do it. They take what the Israelites knew as an event. Paul does it here with the Sodom and Gomorrah event, and with the Old Testament prophecies and how he pulls those in. They all do it that way because they all knew the backstory much better than what we know it. And so Paul can just take 3 or 4 words and stick them into his letter and not have to explain the whole backstory. For us, we got to explain the whole backstory so that we get what he's really saying and how that walks out when we go into the week this week and people say things and people do things. We need to be looking for, okay, what is Yahweh doing here? What is the Spirit doing to pull them into a relationship with himself? Okay? All right, so, questions? Yeah, 3 minutes. Is that too much? I promise we're going to slow down in March. Come on, Randy. What do you got for me?
The reference to the Isaiah talks about laying a stone in Zion,
Yeah.
and a rock that becomes a
Stumbling block.
stumbling block that causes someone to fall. Stone is small, rock is big. I've always found that curious. I have admittedly thought that referred to the law was the stumbling block.
Yeah.
Even in the New Testament context. But you've compared those to Yahweh.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Jesus.
And he's talking about the same thing, though. Their reliance on the law as their salvation was the same thing as in Jeremiah. Their reliance on the king of Assyria as their salvation, rather than their relationship with Yahweh. That's what he was saying in Jeremiah. And that's what Paul's saying. Look, you're relying on your relationship with the law to make you righteous instead of your relationship with Yahweh and what He's done. And for me, that has been a problem, because a lot of times I know I'm right because I trust in my relationship with the Bible rather than my relationship with Yahweh. And that has been really a shift in the way I look at things over the last 5 years.
But maybe, the way I'm thinking about that is, if you relied on the law, which was difficult in and of itself, that made you stumble. Now there's a rock that's going to make you fall. Unless if the rock being Christ, if you stumble on the law, you're really going to have trouble overcoming the rock unless you have faith in the rock, in Christ.
In Christ, yeah. And the event. It just fascinates me, even when, like last night we were talking about the chosen. It just fascinates me that years, all they talked about was the Messiah coming, the Messiah's coming, the Messiah's coming. And then when He's there, they're like, yeah, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for something else. And then just show us a sign. Just, one sign and we'll believe you. Okay, well, we don't believe that sign. Show us a different sign. And I'm like, don't I do that same thing? Don't I just go, okay, God, I know, but if you'll just help me through this, I'll do better. And then you get through it and you go, well, okay, so now I think I did that on my own. We don't say that, but we do. I just need more, help me. And Yahweh is like, if you'll just have more faith in me, I got a bigger plan. Just trust me and walk that out, right?
Yeah, a passage I like is in Matthew, and about this whole stumbling block deal, because Jesus, a lot of times when he's talking to people, He's trying to get them to think out of their normal world that they're in the physical and trying to get them into the spiritual. And He uses certain analogies to do that, and one of the best ones that I can think of is, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. And then he goes and he starts talking into the Jewish people about all these stumbling blocks. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. But woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet cast into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out, throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes than to be cast into the fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that there are angels in heaven that continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, so 1 minute late, it's your fault, not mine. Thank you for being here. Come back and see us. Jess will finish this up over the next 2 weeks, and then we'll move to a different direction. Good times. Appreciate you.